For 30 days, Sarah changed just one thing about what she fed her cattle. She expected them to gain weight. She expected them to become healthier. She expected absolutely nothing unusual to happen. But by the end of the month, Sarah was standing in the middle of her pasture, staring at her herd, wondering if one small decision had somehow changed everything. Because the cattle were behaving differently. And the strangest part? It wasn't just one cow. Almost the entire herd was doing it. Sarah had been raising cattle on her family farm in the American Midwest for years. She knew her animals. She knew which cows were aggressive. She knew which ones were always hungry. She knew which ones preferred staying near the water trough. And she could even recognize several of them from a distance. So when the first strange behavior appeared, she noticed immediately. One morning, Sarah walked toward the pasture carrying a bucket of feed. Normally, the cattle would start moving toward her almost immediately. But that morning, they didn't. They simply stood there. Watching her, Sarah stopped walking. "Okay, that's strange." She shook the bucket. Usually, that sound was enough to bring the entire herd running. But this time, only a few cows moved. The rest remained unusually calm. Sarah didn't think much of it. Maybe they weren't hungry. Maybe the weather had affected them. Maybe they had eaten more grass than usual. But then she noticed something else. The cattle seemed to be spending much more time around one particular part of the pasture. And that was when Sarah remembered the change she had made. 30 days earlier, she had switched one part of their feed. It wasn't some mysterious chemical. It wasn't a miracle supplement. It was simply a different feed mixture designed to provide the cattle with a more consistent balance of energy and nutrients. Sarah had made the change because feed prices had increased, and she wanted to find a practical way to keep her cattle well fed without wasting money. She introduced the new feed gradually. At first, nothing happened. The cattle ate it normally. Their routine stayed the same. So Sarah stopped worrying about it. But after about 2 weeks, she began noticing small differences. Some of the cattle seemed calmer during feeding. They spent more time grazing. And several cows appeared to be maintaining their body condition better. Sarah was pleased. She thought she had finally found a cheaper feeding strategy that actually worked. Then came day 30. Sarah walked into the pasture early in the morning, and that's when she saw something that made her stop. Almost the entire herd was standing together near the same area. They weren't fighting. They weren't panicking. They weren't running. They were simply standing there, facing the same direction. Sarah looked around. There was nothing obvious. No new equipment. No strange animal. No broken fence. Nothing. She walked closer. The cattle turned their heads toward her. Sarah felt uncomfortable. "Why are all of you doing that?" Of course, the cattle didn't answer. But Sarah began watching more carefully. For the next several days, she started keeping notes. She wrote down when the cattle ate, how much feed they received, how long they grazed, how much water they drank, and how they behaved afterward. That's when a pattern began to appear. The change wasn't really about the cattle suddenly becoming different. It was about their routine. The new feeding program had changed how they were receiving energy and nutrients throughout the day, and that could influence behavior. Cattle are ruminants. Their digestive systems are designed to process fibrous plant material through fermentation in the rumen. Their feeding behavior can be influenced by many things: feed composition, availability, weather, water, pasture quality, stress, and the overall management system. Sarah had unknowingly changed several parts of that daily routine simply by changing the feed. And there was another clue. The cattle were spending more time chewing their cud. For an experienced cattle farmer, that can be an important observation. Cud chewing is a normal part of ruminant digestion. After cattle eat, they can regurgitate partially digested feed and chew it again before swallowing it. It's one of the remarkable features of their digestive system. Sarah began realizing that what looked like strange behavior might actually have been her cattle adjusting to a new feeding routine. But she wasn't satisfied yet. She wanted to know whether the change was actually helping the herd. So she contacted a livestock nutrition specialist. She explained exactly what she had changed. The specialist didn't immediately tell her that the new feed was responsible for everything. Instead, he asked questions. How much were the cattle eating? What was the forage quality? Were they drinking normally? Had their body condition changed? Were there signs of illness? Had the weather changed? Had anything else on the farm changed during the same period? Sarah realized something important. Farm animals don't live in a laboratory. There can be dozens of factors affecting them at the same time. Temperature changes, pasture conditions, water availability, parasites, stress, social behavior, feed quality. Even changes in the timing of feeding can affect their routine. So the specialist advised Sarah not to judge the feed based on one unusual observation. She needed to look at the whole herd. And that's exactly what she did. Over the following weeks, Sarah monitored the cattle more carefully than ever. She checked their body condition. She watched their appetite. She monitored their manure consistency. She made sure clean water was always available. And she continued recording their behavior. Eventually, the mystery became much less mysterious. The cattle weren't developing some strange new behavior. Sarah had simply changed an important part of their environment. And because cattle are creatures of routine, even a relatively small management change can produce noticeable differences. But Sarah discovered something else that surprised her. She had been wasting more feed than she realized. Before changing the feeding program, she had been putting out more feed than some of the cattle could efficiently use. Some was being left behind. Some was being trampled. Some was spoiled. And some of the cattle were eating unevenly. The new approach forced Sarah to pay closer attention to exactly what the animals needed. Instead of simply asking, "How much feed should I give them?" she started asking a better question. "How can I feed them more efficiently?" That changed the way she managed the farm. Within months, Sarah had completely changed her feeding records. She measured more carefully. She watched the cattle instead of relying only on assumptions. And she learned to make adjustments gradually, rather than changing everything at once. The lesson wasn't that one magical feed could transform cattle. It was much more practical than that. Sometimes the biggest improvements on a farm don't come from doing something dramatic. They come from paying attention to small details: the feed, the water, the pasture, the timing, the animal's behavior, and the changes that happen when all of those things work together. Sarah eventually walked back into the pasture one evening, carrying the same bucket she had used weeks earlier. This time, the cattle started moving toward her. Not because she had discovered some secret formula, not because she had found a miracle product, but because she had finally learned to understand what her animals were telling her. She smiled. 30 days earlier, she thought she was simply changing their feed. She didn't realize she was about to change the way she managed her entire herd. And that is one of the biggest lessons in farming. Sometimes, the thing that looks like a problem is actually a clue. The question is whether you're paying enough attention to notice it. So if you're raising cattle, don't just watch how much they eat. Watch how they behave. Watch their body condition. Watch their grazing. Watch their cud chewing. Watch their water intake. And most importantly, remember that sudden changes should never automatically be blamed on feed alone. If animals show signs of illness, digestive problems, poor appetite, unusual behavior, or sudden changes in condition, a qualified veterinarian or livestock nutrition professional should be consulted. Because on a farm, the smallest observation can sometimes lead to the biggest discovery. And for Sarah, it all started with one simple decision. She changed one thing in her cattle's feed. 30 days later, she realized the cattle weren't the only thing that had changed. She had changed too.